you for logging in for this event brought to you by the Humanities Center. Today we have, for our speaker, we have Dr. Kyle Brooks, and he will be speaking on ghostly ideals, the hauntology of Black religious leadership. And for our respondent from the Theology and Religious Studies Department, we have Dr. Susie Baca. So thank you all again for logging on and being present. I see quite a few of you are my students. So glad to have you. And yes, you'll get your extra credit when you turn in your assignments. Shall we begin with Dr. Brooks?
And thank you to the good folks at University of San Diego for this invitation. Okay. Title of my talk today is Ghostly Ideals, the Hauntology of Black Religious Leadership. The past is never dead. It's not even past. These are the words of William Faulkner in What Requiem for a Nun. In ways both profound and problematic, the life, death, and narrative afterlife of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. have served as materials for constructing a ghostly ideal of charismatic sociopolitical leadership. So much so that 5 decades after his assassination, many still ask, who or where is the next king? Utilizing Jacques Derrida's concept of hauntology, I make the case that the genealogy of Black religious leadership and sociopolitical life, particularly from the modern civil rights era to the present, has been haunted, so to speak, by a nostalgic mythology of Black male clerical authority. I want to explore this thesis in 3 parts. First, the context and implications of Derrida's concept of hauntology for African-American religious history. How hauntology marks the shape and trajectory of a mythology of Black male clerical authority. And finally, how particular religious leaders afford useful case studies in the ghostly ideals of both Black charismatic authority and academic engagements with Black religious life. So let us proceed. The time is out of joint. O cursed spite that I was ever born to set it right. These are the words uttered by William Shakespeare's protagonist, Hamlet, in response to a ghost. It is this ghost who reveals to Hamlet the circumstance that he must set in order: the murder of his father by his uncle Claudius. The ghost, the specter, exerts its irresistible influence on Hamlet, whose present and future are haunted by a past that is neither dead nor even past. Derrida opens up the body of his text, Spectres of Marx, with this literary epigraph. Spectres of Marx is a book based on a series of talks in which Derrida explores the enduring legacy of Karl Marx and the ideas of Marxism. For the sake of this lecture, you don't need to have extensive background knowledge of Karl Marx. It's enough to know that he was a 19th century German philosopher who's well known for his critiques of capitalism, his theory of how history is produced, and his prediction that the world would ultimately move towards communism. In this work, Derrida is trying to describe how conditions of crisis impact the contemporary understanding and influence of this thinker and his ideas. What are these conditions of crisis? Specifically, Derrida is addressing the fall of communism in Europe, a crisis characterized through such events as the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, or the collapse of the USSR in 1991. So just over a century after the death of Marx, Derrida is contemplating what these failures of communism mean for the life, death, and afterlife of Marx and Marxism. With this context in mind, Derrida turns to a ghost story, in part because of Marx's own fondness of Shakespeare. But more importantly, I believe he chooses this scene for the way it clarifies the thematic shape of Marx's thinking. Derrida makes it plain in this statement. The experience of the specter, That is how Marx will have also thought, described, or diagnosed a certain dramaturgy of modern Europe, notably that of its great unifying projects. It matters that Derrida invokes the concept of dramaturgy. Dramaturgy is a term borrowed from theater studies. This term describes a collection of practices that examine a text, its construction, and the elements of production, such as direction, lighting, design, and costume. Dramaturgy asks about the broader context and themes that shape a story. In other words, Marx characterizes the history of modern Europe as a dramatic production on a worldwide stage. He is concerned with the content, the construction, and the elements of production that contribute to this history. He is invested in the broader context and themes that frame modern Europe and its projects. And the thematic shape of this history is a ghost story. Our friend Hamlet is doing the thing that Derrida argues is so difficult for the scholar: dealing with the ghost, speaking to the specter. And I believe this is Derrida's point. By asking where Marx and Marxism have gone and are going, Derrida is asking, what does it mean to live and move in a world that will always be haunted by their impact? These ghosts are not things from which to escape. They're things that we must follow. Derrida asked this question: what does it mean to follow a ghost? And what if this came down to being followed by it, always persecuted perhaps by the very chase we are leading? Here again, what seems to be out front, the future, comes back in advance from the past, from the back. Here, it's important to note that the ghost that beckons Hamlet is his father's spirit. His future trajectory and his ultimate ends are narrated by this ghost from the past, from the back. And now we begin to understand what it means to say that the time is out of joint. Hamlet's encounter with the ghost is also an encounter with this problem. He has received a destiny by virtue of his birth. He enters the world into a context that he did not produce. He is compelled or constrained to right the wrong of his father's murder by reproducing death again. Hamlet's future is entangled in a seemingly inevitable repetition of the past, a cruel cycle of déjà vu. This is what it means to live with your ghosts. It is the struggle to reckon with your relationship to the no longer living and the not yet living. It's the problem of trying to inhabit your time under the influence of those who seem to be outside of time. Ghosts are always here and not here, in and out of time, immaterial but still carrying material consequence. How could we name this recurring paradox? Let's call it a hauntology. What is hauntology? It's the return or persistence of elements from the past, as in the manner of a ghost. It's also the return and persistence, the paradox of re-encountering the thing that was never truly departed, what is both here and absent at the same time. And I believe the concept of hauntology gives us a framework and a language for describing the return and the persistence of what I call the ghostly ideal of Black religious leadership. In Derrida's estimation, to deal with ghosts is to deal with the politics of memory, inheritance, and genealogy. In other words, the politics of creating, recalling, receiving, and reproducing tradition. To describe the mythology of Black religious leadership as a hauntology means to reckon with how a tradition turns into a ghostly ideal. In her text, Charisma and the Fictions of Black Leadership, literature scholar Erica R. Edwards describes what she refers to as, quote, the charismatic scenario, a cosmology, mythology, and performative technology for African-American mass mobilization that has structured public desires for Black political leadership throughout the long 20th century, from Reconstruction to the present, unquote. She argues that this script of leadership has privileged figures whose speech, aesthetics, and comportment align with a performative ideal. Particularly, this performative regime has been oriented around charismatic male religio-political personalities. And as such, much of the public discourse on Black political leadership, especially since the civil rights era of the mid-20th century, has been dominated by the narrative veneration or exaltation, the lifting up of leaders in this mold. Now, this narrative speaks in some degrees to the social demand for such leaders. In no small way, this demand is connected to the historical position of Black clergymen as both wide-ranging representatives for Black communities and public figures who are afforded a hearing with white audiences. As such, Black clergymen were well situated as public arbiters of the communicative conditions between Black religion and politics. However, a problem arises when such historical arrangements are accepted as always and already structuring the past, present, and futures of Black sociopolitical discourse. Edwards describes the charismatic scenario as a historical container, a loosely scripted series of directions that serves as the basis for reenactment, ritual, and role-playing, and other forms of performance that transmit and transport history and historical knowledge. The charismatic scenario serves as a structuring fiction. It organizes familiar accounts of power, leadership, and aesthetic presentation by guiding the placement and movement of the given actors. With repetition, these accounts solidify as social, political, and historical realities, stories that become dominant frames of our collective memory. The repeated use of the charismatic scenario establishes a charismatic aesthetic, composed of various elements and acts that reconstruct political authority. Black charismatic leadership takes on not only a discrete form, but also a clear style. Edwards' description recalls Marx's approach to the history of modern Europe. Specifically, she is giving us a dramaturgy of Black leadership. She's describing the content, the construction, and the elements of production that transform contingent figures and activities into a consistent performance of power and authority. How does this tradition become both naturalized and mythologized? A part of this has to do with the historical situation of Black preachers since the era of chattel slavery. The writer and civil rights activist James Weldon Johnson notes the work of pioneering Black ministers such as George Liele and Andrew Bryan, who preached to white and Black audiences alike in Georgia in the 1770s. In particular, the history of Liele's ministerial prominence reflects the complex of sensibilities and practices that afforded Black clergymen a hearing and a measure of respect amongst white audiences. In the history of the Negro Church, Carter G. Woodson notes that Liele's ministerial prowess among Georgia's slave population prompted his master to grant him manumission or freedom so that he might work without interruption. We shouldn't miss the significance of this in the midst of chattel slavery, in an era in which the humanity of Black persons is explicitly not given. There's something in the specific practice person and performance of the Black preacher that is valued enough to grant freedom from slavery. But this freedom is intimately connected to the value and the expediency of Black religious leaders to white social, political, and religious authorities. Now, Lyell's effectiveness was certainly aided by his rhetorical gifts. However, Woodson suggests that Lyell's reception by white people of religious and social influence was thoroughly informed by his diplomatic engagement with masters and overseers. His focus on the mere message of Christ against the more egalitarian tendencies of Baptist and Methodist missionaries, his respectable image as a family man, and the wholesome influence of his preaching. Now, we might take these revelations as an indicator that the reception of the Black preacher as an authoritative public figure was quite often linked to his ability to become legible as an asset to white social, political, and economic interests. Now, this is not to say that all Black clergymen fit into this performative scheme. Rather, I'm suggesting that the enduring salience of the Black preacher as a symbolic figure is not divorced from that figure's historical accumulation of credibility and familiarity before white audiences, even as this figure retains the ability to signify in multiple ways. As Charles Hamilton writes, the Black preacher, in those instances where he served as pastor for whites, was the only person of his race during slavery who occupied a position of authority before whites. He spoke, whites listened. So in the person of the Black preacher, we find genuine influence and not merely token presence. It's also worth noting that these pronouns, he and his, are not accidental, both in the history of preaching traditions at large within Christendom, as well as the particular histories of the reception of the Black preacher. A certain masculinist assumption is made with respect to who represent the authoritative bodies for speaking and preaching, as well as the longer rhetorical tradition from which the study of Christian preaching often draws. These traditions, particularly Greco-Roman rhetoric, presumed that public speech was the province of men from the ruling class. Now, by a measure of necessity, the Black preacher became the healer of the sick, the interpreter of the unknown, the supernatural avenger of wrong, and the one who rudely but beautifully expressed the longing, disappointment, and resentment of a stolen and oppressed people. These are the sentiments that W.B. Du Bois writes in his text, The Souls of Black Folk. The Black preacher, as an archetype of Black public leadership, represented the capability for many forms of social and political activity, whether passive or resistant, legal or uncivilly disobedient. To put it another way, the role of the Black preacher was an exceedingly flexible container for a variety of interests and aims. It was a form of organic authority that was informed by social, political, and religious contingencies. But the danger lies in codifying these contingencies as reflections of an unchanging circumstance. Political scientist Adolph Reed critiques this idea of organic authority in his text, The Jesse Jackson Phenomenon, arguing that part of what makes such charismatic figures so attractive is often directly related to their explicit lack of concrete substance. In his landmark text, Economy and Society, sociologist Max Weber offers a description of charismatic authority, which he argues is grounded in, first, the commitment to the heroism or giftedness of an individual figure, and two, that figure's expression of normative patterns or order. He goes on to state that charisma and the charismatic leader are validated by the recognition of those who are subject to that authority. However, this kind of authority is ultimately transitory unless it takes on a more traditional and institutional structure. which helps to routinize the relationship between charismatic figures and their followers. The challenge of such a transition is evident when such leaders disappear and a plan of succession must be developed. Now, it is this specific crisis, namely the loss of the charismatic leader, that informs my analysis. Weber's parameters of charismatic authority call to mind Houston A. Baker's description of the conditions in which Martin Luther King Jr.'s brand of public speech and leadership were most powerfully effective. Baker argues that during the critical decade from 1955 to 1965, Martin Luther King Jr.'s voice and language made the Black public sphere in America more visible and audible than it would have been otherwise. At the same time, Baker names how the Black collectivity in which King's language, symbols, and experiences were steeped gave way to a fragmented contemporary cultural landscape and a changing Black constituency. What seems clear is that the conditions that enabled and sustained King's charismatic authority were already in decline well before his assassination. Now, I believe the subsequent matter of charismatic succession after MLK presents a critical problem for the trajectory of Black religious leadership in the public square. Maintaining charismatic authority requires a transformation into a more traditional or rational structure. Part of what must be sustained in this transformation is a claim to the myth, the fiction, the idealization of the special role and status that animate the charismatic figure and reinforce their claims to validity. I argue that MLK's leadership within a given charismatic scenario, that is, in a historical structure and script for the performance and transport of knowledge, falls prey to a form of nostalgic remembrance. That nostalgia, rather than giving way to other possibilities of Black leadership, underscores a desire to routinize the form and functions of said leadership. Ultimately, the hauntology of Black religious leadership, I argue, is grounded in the attempts to routinize the charismatic authority of MLK into a recurring theme, what I call a ghostly ideal, and an attempt to establish a kind of leadership genealogy and inheritance. Now, this doesn't happen suddenly. It's a slow process of historical contingencies and social reinforcement and performative repetitions. It's a long arc of activity and narrative. And we see some of the way this long arc comes together. Consider Jesse Jackson in the wake of King's assassination, appearing on national television in a shirt stained with the blood of King. We need to take seriously the kind of iconography of these moments. In that moment, Jesse Jackson sidesteps the succession of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, of which Ralph Abernathy Jr. would have become the leader after King, and instead, he becomes the de facto public spokesperson for a broader set of Black social movements within the larger civil rights movement. We could also think about the iconography of a figure who is a protege of Jesse Jackson, the Reverend Al Sharpton. And you might notice in this picture, the medallion that hangs from Sharpton's neck. It is a medallion of MLK. It is a particular piece of jewelry that he wore as a way of always invoking both his lineage within the civil rights movement, but also his belief in his call to carry on a particular form of religio-political leadership in the vein of King. The mythology of MLK has roots in the theopolitical educational vision of his mentor, Morehouse College President Benjamin E. Mays. Historian Barbara Diane Savage makes the argument that Mays's vision for racial progress rested on gendered notions of Black religious and political leadership. Mays was committed to producing a Black male leadership class of educated Black clergy who would be equipped for political influence locally and beyond. Historian Randall Jelks puts it plainly: the Morehouse presidency was not simply a job to Mays. It was his pulpit on the national and world stage. The language of pulpit matters here because it imposes a sense of sacred purpose on Mays's project of Black male development. It also presumes the cultural authority and significance of preaching and clergymen. We can read King's eventual public leadership during the modern civil rights movement as a similar extension of pulpit rhetoric and performance in the world. Simply put, Mays doubles down on the already popular cultural idea of Black clergymen as respected, valid, and authoritative representatives of Black social and political interests. But as Ebony Marshall Turman reminds us, Mays's project, then and now, presents a moral problem because its grounding principle deduces that those made to lead are the arbiters of a very specific embodied perfection. Arguably, MLK stands apart as the most visible example of that model. But that embodied perfection is ultimately a ghostly ideal. It's ghostly because it's elusive, immaterial, never quite able to be captured. This is the problem posed by the narrative sainthood, the myth-making, the larger-than-life imagination that comes from attempting to preserve a cult of heroic Black male genius through the singular charismatic figure. In the wake of King's assassination, we observe the attempts of his successors to grapple with his ghostly presence. The crisis of Black religious leadership manifests as an ongoing struggle to answer the question that Derrida posed. What does it mean to follow a ghost? What does it mean to try and escape the very thing we are after? The ghostly icon of King becomes an impossible ideal that exists only as myth, not as concrete substance. The image, likeness, and aesthetics of his charismatic authority become a ghostly script that his successors follow and are followed by. It makes for a great story, but an impossible repetition. I will end with these thoughts from James Baldwin, who describes the dilemma and the paradox of the Black leader. In his text from the American Scene, The Harlem Ghetto, Winter 1948, Baldwin writes these words: "The terrible thing about being a Negro leader lies in the term itself. I do not merely mean the somewhat condescending differentiation the term implies, but the nicely refined torture a man can experience from having been created and defeated by the same circumstances. That is, Negro leaders have been created by the American scene, which thereafter works against them at every point. And the best that they can hope for is to ultimately work themselves out of their jobs, to nag contemporary American leaders and the members of their own group until a bad situation becomes so complicated and so bad that it cannot be endured any longer. It's like needling a blister until it bursts. In the end, the multiplicity of Black life is the ghost which this nation has yet to properly grapple with. Black life and Black people loom as the ghostly reminder that America has not dealt with, in Charles Long's words, its native sons. In the attempt to conceal the fact of Black deprivation and destruction, American culture refuses the grotesque reality of its own complicity in creating the ghost that now haunts it. So, what do we do with the ghosts? That's a question that remains open to contention and discussion. For the sake of our conversation, suffice to say that the ghost is not just a hauntological problem, but a hermeneutical problem. one that reveals the ways in which we have often misinterpreted the history of this nation and the leaders within it. My hope is that our reckoning with the ghosts of even our most venerated icons will lead us to an understanding of the challenging, complex, and perhaps even grotesque paths we must take towards true liberation. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Brooks, for that stimulating talk. Thank you again. Now it's time for Dr. Babka to offer a response.
Oh my goodness, that was amazing. Thank you so much, Dr. Brooks. I'm stunned. I truly am. It's wonderful. I think that you've done just a brilliant job of bringing together a very, very difficult to hear, but also difficult concepts that Derrida gives us in Hauntology. And so, of course, when Dr. Calloway first talked about this with me, he mentioned Derrida and mentioned the, what the title of your talk was. And so I'm thinking Hauntology. What I immediately went to was Toni Morrison's Beloved and the ghost of Beloved, who is the, if anybody hasn't read the novel by Toni Morrison, Toni Morrison bases her story of Setha, who is an enslaved woman who is able to escape and become free, but she's haunted her entire life by the ghost of a child that she killed in order to prevent that child from becoming enslaved as well. She wanted to save that child a life of slavery because what Setha endured at the hands of her of slave owners and her oppressors was just horrific. And so she thought that was the best way to save her. She said, if I had not killed her, she would have died. And that is something I could not bear to happen to her. So thinking about this, obviously I have to think about where I am in all of this as a white woman who is responsible for so much of the racist rhetoric and the racist events that happen in the world. And so I have to think, where am I in terms of being haunted? I am haunted because Toni Morrison names the slave owners in her novel after, she names them the Garners, after the historical story of Margaret Garner, who was an enslaved woman who actually did kill her toddler daughter in order to keep her toddler daughter from the clutches of slavery. And then, of course, Margaret Garner was captured. She was put on trial. And the white abolitionists, instead of saying, look at how horrible slavery is, that this poor woman had to, do this in order to save her daughter from a life of misery, the white abolitionists, people who look like me, actually made it worse for Margaret Garner, the real Margaret Garner, and actually wanted her to die for what she did. And so that haunts me. I think Toni Morrison wanted to haunt white people by naming them after the historical woman who actually went through this. And so I have to be haunted by the failures of white people in terms of the history, the ongoing colonialism that white supremacy engages in. On the one hand, we have slavery. On the other hand, we have anti-slavery abolitionists, which I want to be, but obviously have not been sufficiently haunted by these memories. And so I think that when raising the specter of King, white people love to sanitize King and take away all of that he stood for in terms of standing up against the Vietnam War, standing up for poverty, standing up for things that really put him on a par with Malcolm X. who white people won't acknowledge as being a leader on par with King. Malcolm X, of course, gives us the best tools, so to speak, for combating genocide. And so it's that these leaders must together haunt whites like me in order to fully understand our role in how we try to make King into someone who looks like me, rather than someone who stands for the anti-white supremacy that he did. So that is, I guess I didn't want to take up too much time. I just thought maybe that I could throw some of that out there in terms of the great Toni Morrison. Thank you so much again for your talk, and I appreciate so much what you did for us today. Thanks.
You're welcome. It's been a pleasure.
I want to now open it for students and other faculty, other scholars, other curious people who want to ask questions as well. I see we have one question in the chat asking about, oh, you already answered this, Dr. Brooks, in terms of scholarship. Are there any other questions from students, faculty, those who are present?
How long has, I've never heard of hauntology, and I wondered if this was modern to this time, or was it who coined this term? I was trying to pay attention because I know that the relics of the past will always, be at the forefront of today's history because of, issues and so forth. But hauntology, when did it get coined, and and how how's it being seen today? I guess that's what I'm trying to get at. Maybe you could kind of brush up my what I'm trying to say, Professor. But yeah, because it's the first time hearing it. I guess yeah.
Got it. No, thank you for that question. So it's perhaps helpful to just talk about how I ended up coming into engagement with this concept. I first came across it, and this is always important, chase down the footnotes. That's where the good stuff really is. So when I was reading Erica Edwards' book, Charisma and the Fictions of Black Leadership, during my process of writing my dissertation, I saw that she made this sort of note that was a reference to Derrida and this idea of a hauntological. And I thought, okay, that's like interesting. Let me see where that goes. So I looked at the note and I saw that it was a reference from Derrida's 1993 text, Spectres of Marx. And this text itself was a compilation of speeches that he gave as keynote addresses at a conference, I believe at Stanford in the early 90s, Whither Marx. Basically, folks were trying to figure out, okay, with all that's happening geopolitically, what do we say to this idea of communism, to the lingering impact or influence of Marx and his ideas? And so he coins this term. To my knowledge, Derrida is the one who coins this term. So that would be about 30 years ago. And it's within various sort of spaces of critical theory. Some writers I've seen, within Black studies, or take up this idea as a way of talking about our interaction with the ghostly or the spectral. Some of the people that come to mind, I'm particularly thinking of Avery Gordon's book, Ghostly Matters, Haunting and the Sociological Imagination, that deals with and takes up some of these themes later into the 2000s. So sometime after Derrida's work. But then also in the recent work by Maurice O. Wallace on his book on MLK, and particularly the sort of sonic world and imagination of Martin Luther King Jr., he also makes reference to both Avery Gordon's work and to Derrida's earlier work around hauntology. So yeah, my sense is that Derrida coins this term, and then it has these interesting ways that it's being taken up, specifically in discourse around Black life and Black leadership.
Thank you for that. I'm, just kind of, weaving together how you got these pieces, because it's always good to get just kind of new assimilation of knowledge and kind of see how that kind of just tethers, historically. But it's very interesting, very interesting. Thank you again.
Thank you for your question, Fatima. And Dean Powell asks, what about today? Are there any Black leaders that can sufficiently step into MLK's shoes, in your opinion? Is there anyone close to his religious and political fervor?
So, interesting question. So I will answer that question in this way. I would say that the shoes of MLK are perhaps not even MLK's shoes in the way we might imagine. And I'll put it, so I'll explain what I mean by that. So in Oklahoma City, there is a church at the corner, the intersection of 2nd and Walnut, by the name of Calvary Baptist Church. The church has been there since 1921. And it plays an interesting and pivotal role in the life and work of MLK, because at 24 years old, Martin Luther King Jr., who originally graduated from Crozier Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania, became a candidate for the pastorate of this church. He preached there, but apparently had a lukewarm impression. The church was not necessarily as interested in him because he was young. They didn't feel like he was old enough. As one person put it, one of the deacons there said, Dr. King didn't have, quote, enough gravy. He hadn't been sort of steeping long enough in his sort of work. Now, the fascinating thing is 2 years later, a few years later, we get Montgomery bus boycott. And King is there on the scene. Why? Because he got turned down from this church in Oklahoma City. So we start to think about the contingent historical factors that lead to King even being present in Montgomery at the time and in the place where he was. For me, these are the kinds of contingent factors that illustrate how impossible it is to kind of capture lightning in a bottle. Which is to say, one of the things that I think gets missed about King is the very particular sort of traditions he's coming from, namely being steeped within this longer tradition of Black pastors, within the Black middle class, within a kind of Black intelligentsia related to the HBCU culture, within this sort of Atlanta social and political circle. But then that also combined with his entrance into the sort of, Northeastern academic elite. So he's moving in these ways that it's difficult to just sort of rotely reproduce that. I think there are a lot of leaders who, and I mean, if we read some of the accounts from the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Andrew Young's words come to mind in one interview where he said, there were a bunch of us in there who all, we're all a bunch of preachers with egos. We all thought we could be doing what King was doing. So there's this contingency there in which who ends up being the person, the icon, is as much a matter of sort of circumstances over which we have no, significant control. I think in some respects, who is the next king is a tricky question, because I think even King himself was facing the decline of the King mythos within his own life. The challenge is, as it said, you either die a hero or live long enough to become the villain. And so I think that part of the historical memory and the mythologizing of King has everything to do with the fact that he dies so young. And so people are left to reckon with, well, what do we do with that death? And this is where I think many people make attempts to kind of routinize that. Jesse Jackson, notably, tries to do his own take on it. Al Sharpton as well, I think it does his own take, but also becomes a much different kind of media figure and popular or, infamous figure. So yeah, I don't know that like there's anyone that quite captures like the moment was the moment. And I think now we realize everyone after, well, they have the benefit of the King mythology to rest on. But I do believe we have to, and I try to go into more depth in this in the book project, how do we kind of reimagine sociopolitical leadership, or more precisely, in our closer examination of even events such as, say, the March on Washington? How does the history of that event and also the way that that event unfolds and happens in the first place reveal the various kinds of sociopolitical leadership that were always present and at work, but didn't occupy the same sort of visible charismatic space?
Thank you. We have quite a few questions in the chat that I want to get to. Dr. Bennett of Dartmouth asks, can Dr. Brooks talk a bit more about why he thinks King's rhetorical archive in particular has become such a singular resource for subsequent Black clergy and freedom fighters? And he also asks, are there other figures that Dr. Brooks sees operating in a comparable fashion within the Black expressive tradition, other prevalent hauntings we can trace in Black politics, Black art, and Black music?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. So first to this rhetorical archive, I think a lot of it has to do with the media capture and reproduction and representation of this archive. And Maurice Wallace's new book really, I think, puts the finger on, there's a kind of sonic and affective quality to the way that King was sounding out and resonating in people's ears and in people's minds. You picture folk gathered around the radio or, the early television sets, seeing King do what he does. And I think there is a sort of unique giftedness to what he did. I think he was absolutely a gifted rhetorician, and singular in the sense that he had a style, a way about him. But I also, I think part of this too has to do with the significance of what a singular narrative, a simpler narrative does to capture popular imagination. So generally people are in search of a sort of simple story. There is a kind of leadership sensibility, I think, that gets entangled in this idea that the simple story is the one we want. It's a kind of mind trap, this desire for the simple story. And so I think King in that way furnishes this kind of capsule of work that people can point to. But even I would say his own sort of rhetorical archive is woefully underutilized for the ways that it gets turned into sound bites. Often King, people don't even actually quote King. What they do is they offer a kind of sentimental, vague notion derived from their feelings about what King said, and particularly their most positive feelings about what King said. As far as comparable people operating in comparable fashion, I mean, I think, notably, Malcolm X comes to mind for me, in part because he also represents a much different stylistic and physically imposing kind of figure. And some of this, I think, is owing to the kind of antagonism built into the way that he's contending for an Islamic perspective on social life and politics and Blackness, that for some folk, it's just, that's a bridge too far. Like, we can deal with the Christian preacher, and I think that also goes a long way into the rhetorical archive. King, folk can see him as contiguous with this Black Baptist Protestant tradition. So he's easier to draw upon. But My goodness, I mean, yeah, we could talk all day about the various ways that I think folk are living within and living with these hauntings in our politics, art, Black music. Yeah, I'll stop there because that could be a longer conversation, but I think you're absolutely spot on about that.
Thank you. Thank you. JP Reynolds wants to know, is there any relationship between ghosts and ancestors?
Yes, yes. Beautiful question. Yeah, so I would say all ghosts are not necessarily our ancestors. And not all ancestors leave the same kind of ghostly presence. I think part of what intrigues me is that so to think about ancestors is to think about those who have at some point existed in this material world and frame. And I ask myself, well, what does it mean for them to become immaterial? I ask this question even of as one who grew up a preacher's kid in the home of my grandfather, who is now deceased. And I think about the ways that I experience and encounter him in dreams. I think about the fact that I had material encounters and experiences with him that no longer exist as a materiality, or at the very least, not as a fleshly material, but they exist as a kind of spectral or memorial material in my mind. I think the question of ancestors too, ancestors implies not just a kind of lineage, but also a particular sort of relationship. Famously, Zora Neale Hurston says, all my skin folk ain't my kinfolk. And when I think of ancestry, I think about a particular relationship cultivated with those who came before us, those whose materiality, whose existence in the world made it possible for us to be here. Ultimately, I mean, I think we reckon with ghosts and ancestors alike. We are forced to ask questions about their influence, whether malevolent or beneficent, and in some way, right? I think Derrida captures this well. The ghosts and even our ancestry, for all the beautiful and problematic ways it informs us, aren't things to run away from or things that we can run away from. But rather, I think we're always negotiating what is our relationship to the past that is never dead and in fact isn't even really past. So hopefully that answers or gets at an answer to your question.
Thank you again. And the final question comes from Ansu, and I'll paraphrase this: does the ghost of King actually cause more problems than it helps? Does it get in the way of progressiveness? Does it get in the way of any sort of Black political advancement? Like, what are the negative implications, and do those outweigh the positive contributions in terms of the ghost of King?
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that literature scholar Houston A. Baker Jr. talks about in his work, Critical Memory and the Black Public Sphere, he discusses this difference between nostalgia and critical memory. And for him, nostalgia is the way that we have a kind of gilded, a smoothed out sort of memory or recall of people, places, events. But critical memory is the hard ethical evaluation of what has happened and what has come before us, and how those things still live and have consequence for the present. I think the question of the ghost of MLK has everything to do with whether we engage that ghost through the lens of nostalgia or through the lens of critical memory. So much has been written and made about, say, for instance, the various indiscretions of MLK, aspects of his very human existence and life, things that remind us that he was indeed a man, a human being, a fallible one. and a no less powerful and impactful one. How we sit with those histories and questions, I think there are various potentials there. One of the potentials is sometimes people use that kind of history or nostalgia as a way of justifying their own contemporary indiscretions. I can be, a little bit messy because, well, I mean, everybody's messy, right? And I think it can become a way of sidestepping our own ethical and moral wrestling with the integrity of our sort of politics and our social movements, our organizing and activism. But I also think that critical memory can function in a way of reminding us that there need not be perfected heroes or sanitized images or sacralized journeys in order for us to draw some meaningful and impactful knowledge and resources for our future work in the world. I do think change does not come by simply reiterating what was, even in its time, already reaching the end of its effectiveness. King himself, poses the idea in his conversation with Harry Belafonte. I fear that we are integrating into a burning house. So in some respects, if the trajectory of King led him to this point of recognizing the integration into a burning house, how much more then does the attempt to replicate his arc of work, his succession of leadership, how much does that also perhaps re-enter into the house that he himself recognized must be vacated? So I think we have to both walk this sort of tightrope between properly recognizing the specific kind of moral courage that King and others of his contemporaries exhibited, which I think we should draw from and take lessons from, while also recognizing that what makes any movement powerful is its contingent response to its moment, to its situation. I believe the power of the story of King, or the stories, the traditions in which King operated, have everything to do with how they enable us to interpret our specific moment, rather than simply trying to replicate a response to a different moment.
And on that note, on behalf of the Humanities Center and the University of San Diego, we want to thank you, Dr. Brooks, for sharing your research, sharing your time, being present, answering our questions. We deeply and truly really appreciate it. We thank you, Dr. Abapka, for being a part of this and for responding and offering your own insights and reactions to Hauntology. So we really appreciate it. Thank you so much. We have another event at the Humanities Center at 4 o'clock. So if you're present on campus, please be present for that. And bid you adieu.